Thank you very much, Rabbi Raskin. The beautiful introduction and precisely the words that we all needed to begin our day the right way and to set the intention for the day ahead. My grandfather of blessed memory was an American Jewish theologian of the first rank. He was an extraordinary orator, an incredible writer, public speaker. But when it came to matters of culture, he was an absolute Philistine. And my grandmother, by contrast, was a longtime patron of the opera. So for years, she was a member of the Metropolitan Opera, and the way it works there, the seating works in such a way that the only way to get closer to the stage is for someone in front of you to die. She was like 3 rows up. Attempted to prevail upon my grandfather to accompany her to an opera, and he had absolutely no interest. So she cajoled, she begged, she pleaded, she threatened, everything until finally he conceded and they decided to go to the opera together. So my grandmother took him to see Carmen, which she felt would be accessible to somebody even with his subpar ability to appreciate culture. So from the very first moments of the very first note the orchestra plays, my grandmother could tell that this was already a performance that would exceed even her very high expectations. She was completely transported to another dimension. And as the very final notes of the last aria ring out, my grandmother is in tears, is on her feet, applauding, bravo, bellissima. She turns to my grandfather and she goes, "So, Norman, what did you think?" And he turns to her and he goes, "You know what, Mindy, it was a religious experience." And she says, "I told you." And he says, "The whole time I was just praying for it to be over already." So, in the annals of religious experience, the United States of America plays an absolutely signal and, in fact, in the current age, primary role. And it's that primary role and its religious underpinnings I'd like to explore today, both from the moment of its founding, but also, and perhaps even more importantly, at an absolutely crucial moral turning point in the history of the United States. It was almost exactly 159 years ago to the day, we'll celebrate the anniversary in about 2 weeks, that on a crisp autumn afternoon, just outside the city of Gettysburg, President Abraham Lincoln delivered what are perhaps the most famous words in the history of American oratory. And I'm willing to venture that all of you could recite those words with me, in fact, word for word. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Stirring words, they flow off the tongue. But I've always been perplexed by them because if you think about it, just consider the scene for a moment. At the Gettysburg Memorial are gathered the widows, the orphans, the bereaved friends of countless thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people who had just perished at the Battle of Gettysburg. Their bodies had just been implanted into the ground. And as these people, distraught, gather looking to be inspired by their president, he makes them do math. How many years has it been since the signing of the Declaration of Independence? How many years? 77. Well, 4 times 20 plus 7, carry the 1. Eventually you come to the idea that it's 87, but for a speaker as accomplished as Abraham Lincoln, it seems so strange that he would use such an infelicitous phrase to express the very simple idea that it's been 87 years since the signing of the Declaration of Independence to the Battle of Gettysburg. Why? Why does he use this phrase 77 years ago? In fact, I can prove to you that Lincoln did not originally have this phrase in mind when he reflected upon the Battle of Gettysburg. You know, nowadays, if you want to visit the White House, it's a whole to-do, and you have to register, and there's security, and there's metal detectors. Once upon a time, for example, during the Civil War, you could just walk up to the White House and ask to see the president, then he would probably come outside. So, right after the Battle of Gettysburg, about 2 days later, maybe 3 days later, a crowd shows up outside of the White House with a band, and they were celebrating the victory at the Battle of Vicksburg, which people in the Capitol had just heard about, and they encounter Lincoln right outside the White House. Lincoln comes out to speak to them, and in a series of impromptu remarks, he tells them the following: "I'm very glad indeed to see you tonight, and yet I'll not say that I thank you for this call, but I do sincerely thank Almighty God for the occasion on which you have called. How long ago is it? 80 some odd years since on the 4th of July, for the first time in the history of the world, a nation, by its representatives, assembled and declared as a self-evident truth that all men are created equal. That was the birthday of the United States of America. Now you can see some of the constituent elements, in fact, really all of the constituent elements of the Gettysburg Address right here. All men are created equal. The real birthday of the United States is the signing of the Declaration rather than the signing of the Constitution. It's all here. The one thing that's not here is 7 years ago. In fact, on July 7th, 1863, the great Abraham Lincoln did not in fact know how many years it had been since the signing of the Declaration of Independence. He thought it was like 80-ish years. So where does the phrase 7 is deliberate, considered. And we know in fact that Lincoln labored over every single word of the address. We have multiple drafts of it. So he chose these words with care. Why? Where did they come from? Now, the answer to that first question is actually relatively simple. The answer is, as in so many of Lincoln's greatest speeches, in fact, all of Lincoln's greatest speeches, he drew his most memorable phrases from that wellspring of American intellectual and moral formation, the Bible. In the words of Psalm 90, in Hebrew, it's Yemei shenosenu vahem shevim shana v'im bigvurosh shmonim shana ki rabam amal v'aven v'gaz chish v'naufa. The days of our years are 80 years and 10, and if by reason of strength they be 80 years. Yet is their strength, labor, and sorrow, for it is soon cut off when we fly away. The words here, the days of our years are 80 years and 10. You can see that phrase here, X score and Y, are right here, and it's actually, in fact, this is the translation of the King James Bible, which, if you grew up the way that Abraham Lincoln did, it is, in fact, very highly likely that in Abraham Lincoln's childhood home there was one book, the King James Bible. Lincoln knew it backwards and forwards. He knew every single phrase of the King James Bible and used it as all the great American orators and writers and artists did in their writing. And Lincoln certainly knew this phrase. He used it all the time, and we'll get back to that in a moment. But the fascinating thing about the King James translation is that it is unusual in that it is actually not faithful to the Hebrew. The Hebrew for 80 years and 10 is shivim, one word, which just means 70. So the King James Bible makes a deliberate choice to go with something a little bit more prosaic, a little bit more poetic in English at least, 80. And the same thing goes for 80. In Hebrew, it's not 4 times 20, it's just shmonim, 80. So the King James Bible makes a deliberate choice to describe the years of a person's lifespan as 80 and 80. And this is where Lincoln got the phrase from. 7 years ago, he's referring to Psalm 90. Okay. The more important question is why? Why did Lincoln refer to Psalm 90 as the very opening verses, as the very opening sentence or phrase of the most important piece of oratory in the history of the American Republic? In order to answer the question, in order to untangle this mystery, we'll need to answer another question, which is, who was the very first person to refer to the time elapsed between the signing of the Declaration of Independence and the Battle of Gettysburg with the phrase 7 years ago? In fact, it was not Lincoln. Lincoln was not the first to do so. He was the second. Who was the first? The first person to do so was a man by the name of Sabato Moraes. And Sabato Moraes was, at the time, the most famous rabbi in all of America. He was the rabbi of Congregation Mikveh Israel, which was known affectionately and still is today as the Synagogue of the American Revolution. It was founded prior to the American founding, but was populated in large part, in fact in whole, by deep and passionate American patriots. And during the Civil War, these were passionate supporters of Abraham Lincoln and the cause of freedom and the Union cause. Rabbi Sabato Moraes, on July 4th, 1863, had been invited by the Union League of Philadelphia to deliver their prestigious Independence Day address. Now, the Union League of Philadelphia was founded to support President Lincoln over the course of the Civil War, comprising some of the most prominent supporters of the Union cause in the entire country, and they were extending a tremendous honor to Rabbi Moraes by asking him to deliver this address, especially so because at the time the Union League of Philadelphia did not allow Jews to be members. It was a black mark upon their record. However, when they asked Rabbi Moraes to deliver the address, he responded that he would do so under one condition, and that was that they would host the event in his synagogue. And so they did. The event was hosted in Congregation Mikveh Israel. Now, July 4th, 1863 was the day after the Battle of Gettysburg. And on that day, Rabbi Moraes ascended the podium, addressing some of the most prominent members of its ranks, or rather the country's ranks, and he said the following: "I am not indifferent, my dear friends, to the event which 77 years ago brought to this new world light and joy. I yield to none in feelings of deep reverence for the sages and patriots that labored for its consummation." There you can see the very phrase that animates, or that introduces to us, that gives us a sense of grandeur at the very opening of the Gettysburg Address, is right here. The day after the Battle of Gettysburg, in Rabbi Sabata Moraes' words, the day after, in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, 77 years ago. That's how long it's been since the American founding. Now, in fact, we know that Lincoln had a copy of this address, that had a copy of Rabbi Moraes' sermon. We know that it was delivered to Lincoln. We know that it was put on his desk. In fact, other than a recording of Abraham Lincoln saying, "I read Rabbi Moraes' sermon," we are about as sure that Lincoln read this as we are sure that Lincoln read anything. So we know that Lincoln had this sermon, and in fact, as I'll argue in a moment, I almost said Rabbi Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was in fact responding to this sermon. But first, before we go any further, let's return to our original question. Why would anybody, Lincoln, Rabbi Moraes, why would people refer to the time elapsed since the founding of America, the signing of the Declaration, to the Gettysburg Address with the words of Psalm 90? It wasn't just Lincoln, it was Rabbi Moraes. Why would they both do this? And in order to understand this, we need to explore a little bit about Psalm 90 itself and its import in the history of American letters since the founding. If you recall the words of Psalm 90 from a moment before, they tell us about the normal span of a human life, at least during the era of the Psalms. What is a normal human life? Yemei shenosenu vahem shivim shana, the days of our lives are 70 years, ve'im bigvuros, and if by reason of strength, shmonim shana, they be 80. So a normal person lives for 70 years. 70 years is a normal lifespan. If you're lucky, you live until 80. If you're an exceptionally vigorous person, 80 is how far you get. Anything past 80 is, to borrow a phrase, house money. So, whenever, in the course of American arts and letters, people wanted to express the idea that something was ancient or old on its last legs, something was nearing the end, they would use, or they would insert a reference to this psalm. For example, how many of you have read the Scarlet Letter by Hawthorne? So enough of you were tortured like I was in high school. No, it's a great book. But all great authors would always use references to this psalm whenever they would describe something that was old or decrepit or whatever it is. So for example, Hawthorne, when he writes the Scarlet Letter, so some of you may be familiar with the story, Hester Prynne and adultery and so forth, but the way that Hawthorne opens the book is, in fact, he claims not to have written the book at all. It's fictional, but he claims not to have written the book at all. He says, "I actually discovered the book," and in doing so, he compares it to the scroll of Esther. That's a whole separate thing. But Hawthorne says, "I discovered a scroll in the customs house where I worked," and he then proceeds to tell this sort of semi-autobiographical story about how the semi-fictional, semi-autobiographical story about his life at the customs house before he found the Scarlet Letter scroll. And he describes a couple of the people who worked with him at the customs house, and two of them are of note for us: the inspector and the collector. The inspector and the collector were both older gentlemen, and here's how he describes them. He says, "The inspector, when I first knew him, was a man of 80 years or thereabouts, and certainly one of the most wonderful specimens of wintergreen that you would be likely to discover in a lifetime search." The inspector, in other words, was old, probably at the end of his life, but he was doing good for his age. That's what Hawthorne is trying to convey. And because he's trying to convey that, he uses the words of Psalm 90, as you would expect. Similarly, the brave soldier, the collector, had already numbered nearly or quite his 80 years and 10, and was pursuing the remainder of his earthly march burdened with infirmities. I mean, Hawthorne's such a master stylist. But here you can see that Hawthorne is expressing the idea that the collector too was old and on his last legs, again by referring to the words of Psalm 90. And in fact, I could multiply this example many, many, many dozens of times, if not hundreds of times, if you're willing to descend to the B ranks of American letters, but certainly in the A ranks. Anyone who wanted to express this idea that something was old and on its last legs would refer to Psalm 90. Which brings us back to Rabbi Moraes on July 4th, 1863. When we think today of the Battle of Gettysburg, we think of it as a magnificent turning point in American history, the day that the tide turned against the Confederate forces in favor of Lincoln and the Union forces. It was a magnificent victory. It was a massive blow to America's enemies, etc., etc. And it's true, it was that in historical hindsight, in retrospect. But at the time, it was widely considered a catastrophe. First of all, strategically, Lincoln was despondent the day after Gettysburg, and he was furious at the commanding general of the Union forces at Gettysburg, General George Meade, because Meade was facing the legendary military commander Robert E. Lee, of whom he was deathly afraid. And even though he had defeated him in battle, he was so terrified of him that he let Lee escape across the Potomac and didn't pursue him. Lincoln was convinced, rightly, that Meade could have ended the Civil War on July 3rd, 1863, but because of a failure of nerve, he did not. Lincoln was despondent. Moreover, in human terms, how many of you have ever visited the Vietnam War Memorial in D.C.? Does anyone here know how many names are on the Vietnam War Memorial? 55,000 names, thereabouts. Do you know how many casualties there were at the Battle of Gettysburg? Just under 55,000. In 3 days, there were more American casualties at the Battle of Gettysburg than in the entire Vietnam War. Gettysburg was a catastrophe of epic proportions. The real victory that the Union won that day, and the very same day, in fact, as the Battle of Gettysburg, was all the way out in the West at the Battle of Vicksburg, where Union forces were commanded by a then relatively unknown commander who would one day become the President of the United States, Ulysses S. Grant. But at the time, Gettysburg was seen as if not a defeat, the closest thing to. So much so that because the Union had never won a convincing battle in the war yet, Gettysburg was actually seen the day after Gettysburg as the end of the war effort. Now consider yourself, or rather try to imagine yourself, as a member of the Union League of Philadelphia, or as a member of Congregation Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia. Far away from Gettysburg as you were, it was really a matter of miles, not states. Every single person in Rabbi Moraes' audience knew multiple people who had been slaughtered the day before. Every single person was in despair over the cause of freedom and the Union war effort. And so it was that Rabbi Moraes stepped to the podium, just as I am now, and he recited to his congregation, the American congregation as it were, the following words. I'm not indifferent, my dear friends, to the event which 77 years ago brought to this new world light and joy. But the more intently I gaze upon the bright past, the darker does the present appear in my vision. So why does Rabbi Moraes use the words of Psalm 90 to refer to the time elapsed between the Declaration of Independence and the Battle of Gettysburg? Why does he say 77 years ago? The reason is because Rabbi Moraes thought, as did everyone in his audience, and as did hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people across these United States, they all thought that America was finished. This was the end of the American experiment. We had a good run, but this was it. America had already not only exceeded its 60 years and 10, it had exceeded its 80 years, if by reason of strength they be 80. America was over 80 years old. This is when things die. America is finished. Rabbi Moraes wasn't happy about it. He was in despair about it. In fact, July 4th, 1863, on the biblical calendar, if you read the book of Kings, the book of Jeremiah, was what's called the 17th of Tammuz. The 17th of Tammuz is the day that the Babylonian encirclement of Jerusalem began, or rather was pressed forward, and the walls of Jerusalem were broken through. July 4th, 1863 was that very same day in the biblical calendar. And so Rabbi Moraes compared the overthrow of Israel in biblical times to the very same thing that America was experiencing at this very moment, July 4th, 1863. Rabbi Moraes was speaking for a nation when he said, it has been 77 years since the American founding, and we are now at the American funeral. And so it was that Lincoln received these words in the White House from his friend, from his colleague, from a fellow theologian of the American experiment, Rabbi Moraes. And here's where Lincoln makes perhaps the most magnificent innovation in the history of American moral thinking. Lincoln says, yes, America has exceeded its 80 years. It has been 80 years, 7 years, in fact, since the American founding. The American experiment, or rather, the American Republic, is finished. But all that means, says Lincoln, is that we have been granted, through the grace and mercy of God, the opportunity to try again. Yes, America can and will fail, but that only means that we have yet another opportunity to recommit ourselves to the extraordinary virtue of the American Republic. And here, Lincoln makes a massive innovation in American moral thinking. Think about how Lincoln describes the eternal truth, the American founding, the truth of the American founding, that all men are created equal. What does Lincoln call the idea that all men are created equal? He calls it a proposition. A new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Is that idea that all men are created equal a proposition? Is that how the American founders referred to it? No. What did the American founders call it? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They referred to that idea as a self-evident truth. Nowadays, this distinction means little to us. But in the 19th century, this would have been a distinction with all the difference in the world, because these terms were drawn from Euclidean geometry, which is not new math, suffice it to say, or Common Core, suffice it to say. But in the 19th century, every single person would have known the difference between a proposition and a self-evident truth. A self-evident truth is an idea so obvious that it doesn't even need to be demonstrated. It simply is. 1 + 1 = 2 is a self-evident truth. A proposition is an idea that needs to be demonstrated, that needs to be proven. Now in America, in 1863, the idea that all men are created equal was not, as Lincoln observed, a self-evident truth, because so many of our countrymen had been held involuntarily in slavery. So what did that mean? That America was worthless? That it was a sham? That this idea was nothing but a moral and civic charade? Absolutely not, says Lincoln. What that means is that human equality is not a self-evident truth, or it can be, but isn't yet a self-evident truth. It's a proposition. It is an idea, a virtuous and wonderful idea that needs to be demonstrated. And needs to be demonstrated, as Lincoln says in the magisterial words of his second inaugural, until every drop of blood drawn with the lash is paid for by another drawn with the sword. Human equality is something that we need to fight for. Human dignity and human freedom, the great limitless potential of the human person, and the idea that we are free to pursue virtue, and that in fact we must together collectively pursue goodness and greatness, is something we need to fight for. It's a proposition. It's not a self-evident truth, not yet. As Lincoln understood better than anybody, the United States of America is not an outcome, it's an aspiration. And so the question becomes, how? How do we recommit ourselves to the great promise, to the great extraordinary virtue of the American covenant? How do we renew the American promise? That's our task here today, in America in 2022, and here in this very room. How do we renew our commitment to the American promise? How do we restore our faith in the American experiment? And the answer, I believe, is twofold. First, we should try our best not to succumb to the sound and fury of social media, to the squalor of American resentments, but rather recommit ourselves, or rather reacquaint ourselves with that very resource that has always guided our ancestors and predecessors to ever greater heights at every historical crossroads. We must remember and recommit ourselves to that eternal, timeless biblical idea that it is always and forever the content of one's character, not the color of one's skin, not one's political opinions, not one's financial prowess, that determine a person's worth and that allow a person to participate in the grand experiment of human existence and the American experiment in virtue and freedom. And second, and perhaps most importantly, we need to remember that America has a higher purpose. We are more than just a nation, a random collection of individuals huddled together. We are a people with a purpose. And how do we heal from our failure of nerve in this respect, our lack of self-confidence in the American idea? The answer is we need to reacquaint ourselves with the revolutionary biblical idea of divine election, of chosenness. Much like the chosenness of the ancient Israelites, which God bestows as a promise, nations can access chosenness, perhaps not as a promise in the same way that ancient Israel was, but in a contingent sense. As Lincoln referred to the American Republic very deliberately, we are an almost chosen people. Chosenness in the history of American civics and morality does not mean, as some hot-headed folks would have it, that God blesses and sanctions everything that America does, or that everything America does is by definition correct. But what it does mean, as it meant and means for the people of Israel, is that we are chosen not for superiority, but for responsibility, for service. We have a responsibility to be a source for goodness and virtue in the world. To paraphrase the words of the Hebrew prophets, we are to be a lab unto the nations, to be a source for experiments in goodness, in virtue, in freedom, in liberty. Now, sometimes we fail in those experiments. Sometimes we fail in those efforts. Sometimes we exceed our 70. Sometimes we exceed our 80 by reason of strength. But that doesn't mean that America is finished, is over. That means, as Lincoln said in the Gettysburg Address, that we have an opportunity for a new birth of freedom. And I'll close with a final thought. Psalm 90, does anyone remember how Psalm 90 begins? Psalm 90, most Psalms, their authorship is ascribed to David, but some Psalms are not, and this is one of them. Does anyone remember to whom this Psalm is ascribed? Moses, excellent. This is a prayer of Moses. Now, as the medieval commentators on the Bible all noted, it would be very strange for Moses to have authored, it seems very strange for Moses to have authored the Psalm that says that a normal human life is 70 years, and if you're lucky, it's 80 years, because how long did Moses live according to the Bible's account? 120 years. My grandfather always used to joke, when you turn 80, how do you, in the Jewish tradition, when a person turns 80, what do you wish them? You say, Ad me'en 20. You say you should live until 120 years old, just like Moses. When you turn 90, what do you say? You should live until 120 years. Turn 100, you should live until 120 years. What happens when you turn 120? You say, Have a nice day. The medieval commentators pointed out that in Psalm 90, in fact, Moses is speaking about himself, counterintuitively. Why? If you'll recall the book of Exodus tells us that when Moses encountered God at the burning bush, how old was he? He was 80. Prior to encountering God at the burning bush, Moses had lived a full life. He'd grown up in a palace. He had experienced rebellion, persecution. He had seen the worst of humanity and the best of humanity. He'd run away. He'd married a foreign princess. He'd pursued a successful career as a shepherd. Had Moses died at age 80, his funeral would have been a tribute to a life well and virtuously and fully lived. And yet at the same time, by reason of strength, Moses had 80. And yet, it was at age 80 that Moses' life just began. The Moses that we know, Moses the lawgiver, Moses the liberator, Moses our teacher, Moses the historical, moral icon, that Moses began at 80 years. We have an opportunity for a new birth of freedom in this year, 2022. Our purpose over the course of today at this gathering is to begin to pursue that new purpose, to think together about what it means to pursue that purpose. What are our values? What is our mission? And what are some practical suggestions that we can take to begin that work? Because, as a very wise man once said, in dreams begin responsibilities. And that's what we're here today to do. So may we be blessed, even as we have exceeded our 80 years and 7, many, many, many times over as a nation. May we merit together as a people to experience in the days, months, and years ahead a new birth of freedom. Thank you.